welcome to the Wizard of Radical Self-Respect. My name is Jared Mello. Today, I want to go over the difference between narcissism and CPTSD. And this is a good topic to talk about because they can look pretty similar. But before I get into the similarities and the differences, know this. If someone is consistently treating you poorly and they can't respect your boundaries, they can't disagree in a healthy way, or resolve conflict in a healthy way, a healthy relationship and mature relationship will be much more difficult to have with them, regardless of what you call it. And I wanted to make sure I said that first and foremost because at the end of the day, the behaviors are what matters, more so than the label. If someone with CPTSD is treating you very poorly, it doesn't matter that they don't have NPD at that point. They're treating you poorly, and you have to act accordingly from there. But what are 3 ways that narcissism is very similar to CPTSD? 1, they can both be very sensitive to criticism, where if they're criticized, they'll act very defensive, they might lash out, rage, flip the script, avoid accountability, all pretty negative things. And then the other 2 go hand in hand, playing the victim and acting entitled. Both of those things can be pretty manipulative and not very good for that matter. And either way, though, a victim is not supposed to be anyone's identity. And if they're both doing that, making being a victim their identity in order to get special privileges and be entitled, not a good thing, regardless of what they really are. Keep that in mind as well. But those are 3 of the ways that they can look pretty similar. Now, the difference is, though, and this is the behaviors to look for. Now, the person with CPTSD, they should have a little more empathy than the person that is a narcissist. Now, how will that empathy portray itself? Because that's really what matters here. And I think there's 3 ways that the person who has CPTSD, how their empathy will display itself, that it'll be much more difficult for the narcissist to do these things. And those 3 things are admit when they're wrong, admit they have a problem, and be able to apologize. The person with CPTSD, hopefully, they can do those things. And if they can't, it's going to be a problem no matter what you call it. The narcissist rarely admits when they're wrong, rarely admits they have a problem, and so they never even begin the process of getting better. And as far as apologies are concerned, narcissists love to do the deflection apology. Sorry, that wasn't my intention. Sorry you feel that way. And to clarify, sorry, that wasn't my intention can be okay depending on the circumstance. But if they actually did something wrong and they're just flipping it back to the other person as a deflection, that is when sorry, that wasn't my intention. That doesn't really cut it anymore. But either way, the only real apology is changed behavior at that rate. So those are things the person with CPTSD should be able to do because they have a little more empathy often than the person with NPD. But even the person with CPTSD, especially if there's an addiction involved, they can also have some impaired empathy. And that would also then ramp up the manipulation and might also ramp up the exploitation as well, especially if there's an addiction there. That's something to be mindful of too. Now, the reasons why they might be using could also be different too, which gets me to another difference of a narcissist core as opposed to a person with CPTSD. The person who is a narcissist, they will be addicted to the drug of narcissistic supply, and they need that in order to serve their ego functions, to make sure they regulate their sense of self. If they don't get the 3 A's, attention, admiration, acknowledgement, they will feel depressed, lethargic, and miserable. And they need that. And they might also struggle with drinking and drugs, which could be similar to the person with CPTSD, but for a different reason, oftentimes. The person with CPTSD, they're often trying to self-medicate their anxiety, depression, etc., which a narcissist also has a little bit as well. That's why this can really be tricky. But hopefully, eventually the person with CPTSD can admit they have an issue and then try to do something about it. The other difference is the narcissist will have fantasies of unlimited success, power, wealth, brilliance, ideal beauty, ideal love, or fill in the blank with whatever they really want in life, adulation, admiration. That's what they're going to be after. The CPTSD person, they're not going to have that to the same extent. But again, they might try to escape. They might try to escape with their addictions, and one of their addictions might be drugs and alcohol, it might be gambling, it might be sex, and that can look similar to a narcissistic person who is seeking supply. And again, that's why this can be really tricky here when you're looking at their behaviors. They can look similar. The only difference is the reasons behind their behaviors. But when you're just observing their behaviors, the reasons doesn't really matter as much at that point. You just see the behaviors. That's why I say the behaviors that will be different. Being able to apologize, being able to admit when they're wrong, and being able to admit they have a problem. Those are three things I would hope the person with CPTSD can do that I know people who are narcissists definitely struggle a lot with. But again, not impossible, but certainly much less likely. And this stems from the narcissistic person's lack of empathy. And the person who has CPTSD should have a little more empathy, but in the case that they're gone down addictions lane, their empathy can be a little more impaired in that case too. And their exploitation and their manipulation may also be ramped up too on the CPTSD side. But those are the pros and cons there. It's not extremely cut and dry. They can look pretty similar. But at the end of the day, regardless of the label, if someone's behaviors are consistently erratic, consistently problematic, consistently abusive, consistently can't treat you well, consistently can't resolve conflicts together, it doesn't matter what you call it in that case. In that case, the best thing to do is probably to keep it moving, regardless of what you call it, unfortunately. And everyone has to be really honest with themselves too. Maybe someone recognizes, okay, this person has CPTSD, they have a little empathy, they're not a narcissist, and you might be tempted to have a longer leash with them because you think they're not a narcissist, so I'm going to try to make this work. But a couple things to remember. You really got to understand and be honest with yourself what you can handle. And you got to know what your tolerance level is, what amount of disrespect or dysfunction you're willing to put up with. And that will be different for everybody. I don't want to make that decision for you, but it's something that you're going to have to think about. And I know people are going to want to have a longer leash with the CPTSD person, understandably. But I'm also saying, if their behavior doesn't improve and they consistently keep on doing these things, that's not a good thing, regardless of what you call it. And the other issue may be someone who struggles with codependency, or maybe who is an empath, perhaps. They might be tempted to try to do the work for the person. But we got to remember, we can't help anyone that doesn't want to help themselves. And it might be tempting, but the most we should ever do is match that person's effort. We can't do more for them than they're willing to do for themselves. I wish I could shout that from the rooftops, but especially for people who are codependent or empaths, they need that tattooed on their foreheads. Don't do more for them than they are willing to do for themselves. You can't do the work for them. They have to be willing to do it on their own. Now, they can do it with help, but they have to do it with willingness. You can't do more than they're willing to do for themselves. And again, hopefully, the person with CPTSD will be able to admit they have a problem and admit when they're wrong, and then try to do something about it. But I would be lying if I said that always happens right away. Sometimes it can happen years later, and it can take a long time. And again, especially when there's addictions involved, and someone gets a drug habit or becomes an alcoholic, it adds another layer, and that person will probably act more narcissistic even too, in that case, when they're in the quote-unquote active addiction. So again, people need to really be honest with themselves and don't try to do too much. You can't help anybody that doesn't want to help themselves. And you got to really be honest about what you're willing to handle and what you're willing to put up with and accept. But at the end of the day, the behaviors will tell the tale, and the labels don't matter as much as the behaviors they are displaying. That's what I want people to focus on. And to reiterate the video here, the 3 ways they're similar: sensitivity to criticism, entitlement, playing the victim, and they both may have issues with drugs and alcohol. That's another way they could both be very similar. The differences would be why they're doing that. The narcissist needs the drug narcissistic supply. They need to be filling up on attention, admiration, and acknowledgement. And they're going to have the fantasies of power, success, brilliance, ideal love, beauty, etc. The person with CPTSD, they might be self-medicating with drugs and alcohol, or chasing sex, or gambling, or something along those lines. But it's for a different reason. It's self-medicating. But I could also argue the narcissist is self-medicating, but they're self-medicating something different. They're self-medicating their needs for supply. The person with CPTSD, often self-medicating anxiety, depression. Often self-medicating from their traumatic experience. But again, narcissism often came from trauma, and a combination of genetics too. And that's why this becomes so difficult, because similar causes, similar behaviors, small differences. And the small differences are from, hopefully, the empathy the person with CPTSD has. And I think one of the big differences is often the person with CPTSD, the later that trauma happened in their lives, the more likely their base level will at least be able to attempt to recover and heal. They're not as far gone. The narcissistic person, they went off the reservation, usually between the ages of 4 to 8. And it was something that happened to them in their childhood, and there's not much they can do about it. They can try to do behavior modification and cures. Occasionally someone can get older and get a little better, but for the most part it's very difficult. And since it happened so young, very difficult. The person that had trauma later in life, their formative years may have been a little less tarnished, and that's where their empathy may come from, if I had to guess. But those to me are the similarities and differences between CPTSD and narcissism. It's not easy to tell the difference here, and they can look pretty similar. But just remember, at the end of the day, the labels don't matter. It's the behaviors that matter. And you have to really be honest with yourself about what you're willing to put up with. And just because they may have CPTSD and they're not a narcissist, you might be tempted to have a longer leash in that case. But if their behaviors aren't changing and they can't admit when they're wrong and they aren't willing to do anything different and they never apologize and they treat you poorly, what's the difference at that point? What's the difference between them and a narcissist if they do all of the same things and they never improve? The answer is there really is no difference, and so that in that regard, the label doesn't matter. So if you got this far, please remember to like the video if you liked it, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I talk a lot about narcissism, self-help, a little bit of dating, and I have an interview series too. And please share this video with someone that you think might benefit from hearing the message. And comment below if you think I missed anything between the differences and similarities of CPTSD and narcissism. If you have CPTSD, comment your experience below. Or if you're a self-aware narcissist, comment your experience about that too. Or a borderline, because a borderline can be almost a mixture of those things in a way. So if you're borderline out there, you can comment that below too. So again, thank you very much for watching and have a great rest of your day.